Salutations everyone, it is Matty here today, and welcome to my review for Darksiders 3. This is a sneaky release that hopes to surprise gamers, as the Darksiders series usually serves well in the category of hidden gems, mashing together aspects of other games into their own and calling it a day. Can the third entry, releasing on November 27th for the PS4, Xbox One, and PC for $60, replicate some of that magic? Let's dig in and find out, starting off with the story. You play as Fury, one of the four horsemen, and you are tasked by the Charred Council to eliminate the 7 deadly sins scattered about the world and restore balance after the apocalypse has just hit Earth. The game goes for a morally gray approach by focusing on said balance, not just trying to be just or evil. The title also leans heavily into the story of the first Darksiders game. It felt like knowing War's tale was actually more important than deaths in Darksiders 2. So if you're really hellbent on playing Darksiders 3, make sure you at least have some awareness of what happened in the first Darksiders title. Now, the core theme of all this is Fury's attempts to gradually understand and eventually relate to humanity, not viewing herself above them, but equal with them, even though she is such a powerhouse in so many ways, shapes, and forms. Now, when chasing down the 7 deadly sins, some felt more important than others. Fury alludes to her past with wrath, but that isn't explained at all. However, lust makes a very powerful impact on the story and provides arguably the best varied boss sequence in the game, yet there's hardly any build-up for that one. The chase for these 7 deadly sins feels all over the place and struggles with a narrative focus because sometimes the story wants to build Fury as a character and make gamers invested in her, but doesn't finish on that end, and other times it wants to build her enemies, the ones she's chasing down, but it doesn't finish over there either, so it never does well on either side. Ultimately, most of these story beats along the way are easy to predict, and so what we're left with is a fairly average tale that's enough to push you from point to point. It's serviceable enough, but it's nothing that's going to blow your socks off. Fury herself is probably the most interesting of all the horsemen I've had a chance to play as in the prior entries for this series, but once again, it's nothing over the top with storytelling compared to what we've experienced in recent years. Now let's shift over to the gameplay, which is a larger focus for the Darksiders franchise. Darksiders was oft cast into the shadow of games like God of War and Zelda, with many comparisons being made between the series, often mimicking them but not creating enough identity for itself to truly stand out. It's a series that has notoriously struggled to find an iota of identity, and sadly, instead of innovating, Darksiders 3 decides to hop into the shadows of another series. This time, it's Dark Souls. However, that doesn't make it too bad, just familiar. As you progress through the story, you unlock items called hollows that alter the form of Fury, allowing for variation in puzzle design and platforming, which is actually solid stuff. Oddly enough, the combat doesn't change all too much outside the Force Hollow being strong enough to break the guard of enemies, which is something that's very important to use, so often I found myself leaning on that hollow as soon as I unlocked it. You have a basic attack with your whip, which can reach across and hit multiple enemies, and your alternate attack changes based on the hollow equip, so you can have a spear coated in lightning, blades of flames, a devastating hammer, or a great sword with frost on it. The player is able to mix and match these attacks for very simple combos. There is also dodging, which when timed correctly can give you a window to counterattack, dealing some bonus damage and possibly stunning your foes. One issue with the countering is that when you're locked onto a target and dodge, you can only go in 4 directions: forward, backwards, left, and right. This means that during battles with multiple enemies, which happens pretty often, things can get irritable as you're bound to get hit by someone, and it's out of your control since dodging is limited to certain directions, and thus you can't focus on a specific target. Now, you may ask, why not just stop locking on and swing for the fences? But sadly, the camera then pulls in a bit closer to the action when you're not locked on, so it becomes difficult to track all the action and dodge exactly what you thought you were trying to avoid, and now you find yourself with a system that battles against itself. The camera continuously collides with the wall when in tight spaces, and took responsibility for many a death, which in a game focusing to be somewhat like Souls simply cannot be allowed. Now, I love the Havoc form in this game. It's a really OP way of taking out your enemies. and if used in the right moments, it can make you feel like a total badass. I save this form usually for boss fights, but it's another tool on the belt of players nonetheless. You can also visit the Maker's Forge to upgrade weapons and enchantments, which is completely watered down compared to Darksiders 2, where you were constantly in that loop of cycling out and upgrading gear collected from the world and enemies. In Darksiders 3, you collect adamantine pieces to bring to the makers, who can provide basic upgrades to the damage of said weapons. You can also slot in a very limited amount of enchantments found around the world to your weapon, which can then be upgraded with demon and angelic artifacts, along with a final upgrade requiring a soul of the chosen, which you get from these mini boss fights, which are a bit tough. Ultimately though, it's incredibly simple and is a complete step down from the previous entry, which really took things further for the series for its time. On top of all this, souls can be collected and spent at Vulgrim's store a la Dark Souls. If you die, you drop all of them, so do be careful. These souls can then be spent on items that temporarily buff you in strength, protection, allow you to revive yourself mid-combat, etc., or to level up Fury, where you can assign an attribute point in one of 3 areas, which are health, physical damage, and arcane damage. Overall, I didn't feel like spending a lot of points in one single category was super beneficial, and just equally going across the board on all of them kept Fury at a solid strength, but I never felt too powerful, which I think is pretty important for these types of games. Similar to Dark Souls is the way that the world is built, which should not be undermined simply due to the issues I have with this title. Many attempt to create an interconnected world, and quite honestly they fail, but this is one that actually works and manages to maintain all the puzzles, which is a series staple and I think a hard task to accomplish. Along the way, you will encounter some pretty and not so pretty locales. The game often looks like a title belonging back in the PS3 and 360 generation, and with some of the systems and changes made to the series, it almost belongs there. But even with these gameplay regressions, it would still be a disappointing entry for the series searching for its identity back then. Despite the build of the world being interconnected, the technology woefully underperforms to a borderline frustrating amount. Multiple times when you're heading from area to area, this game will stop to load in the next location you're entering. Like I said, it's just from a previous generation. It becomes tiresome because when you die and respawn far away, which is fairly common and something I can easily deal with, you'd have to trek through some puzzles, some enemies, which, you know, typical Souls stuff minus the puzzles, but also a million loading screens, often 3 times within a single minute. Sadly, I ended up feeling so disengaged, especially when dying to the game's fairly well-designed and varied bosses, because there were so many loading bits between me dying and going to the boss one more time for that other attempt at them. More tech issues crop up with textures not loading in, and that's something that's punctuated in the cutscenes where faces will be muddy and not fully load in for an extra second, which can then serve to further disengage the player on top of already shoddy facial animations. The frame rate here can get a bit choppy in the busier parts of the world that try to do something a bit more interesting than crawling through the tunnels of an old subway system. Fortunately, there is a good balance between puzzles and combat, and while the combat is simple to the very fundamentals, it actually works well and can be very satisfying at times, so by no means is this bad. Darksiders 3 provides a very enjoyable challenge at times with some varied mob enemies and boss fights that kept me focused and on my toes. It's just a shame that a lot of the good here is marred by woeful technical problems and some super odd design choices I highlighted earlier. Next, it's over to the sound, which may be the shortest sound segment I've ever done in a review. Now, why, do you ask? Well, often the levels are lacking in music and the silence is only broken by the cries of some enemies and pieces of the environment. Likely another page taken from the Souls book to help build some ambiance. But it just feels quiet and not in the good way. Some games clutter the package with far too much sound that you can't even hear yourself think, but this game goes so silent that when a track of music plays outside of a boss fight, you just go, oh right, my TV actually wasn't muted. This may just be me, and I fully admit that. Most of you know I hit on sound a lot more than most, so it could be my personal taste, but it was a very standout omission. The voice acting in this game, much like the rest of the title, is serviceable. It gets the job done. Nobody really elevates moments to greatness. Couple that with some not great storytelling, and there's really nothing to actually elevate, but it just gets the job done. The sound overall is not amazing, but it's not bad by any means. So now, with that very short sound segment concluded, let's move on to my verdict. The way I describe Darksiders 3 is the ideal bargain bin game. You will see it sitting there one fine afternoon in your local store for about $20. You'll pick it up on a whim and you'll be satisfied with your purchase. You'll be a little bit more understandable with the issues I have currently at the price of $60, which is completely ridiculous for a lot of the things that this game is severely lacking and being especially low tech. Overall, it's a fun time and one that should not be outright skipped because there are some redeeming qualities here, and the Darksiders series has a unique charm to it that I think will appeal to a lot of gamers. But right now, compared to Darksiders 2, this is just a step backwards and then some, especially being on some new technology. Like I said, this feels like a game that belongs back in 2012. Anyway, those are just my thoughts on Darksiders 3. Let me know what you think of this title in the comments down below, and if you have any more questions, do fire away, ladies and gentlemen. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, like me on Facebook. Those links are in the description down below, along with my Patreon. Do consider supporting that as it fuels all the content I create here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.